So please do check out the website, look at some of the other great sessions that are happening all week long, and I'll speak more about them just at the very end of this session. So what is ICE Jam? ICE Jam, in a nutshell, are events that we're putting on as Center ICE to help folks network, learn, and socialize around topics that are related to entrepreneurship, innovation, creating meaningful social and environmental impact through those various efforts. And it's a really great time with Startup Week, so we're hosting 7 events during this week as part of the overall ICE Jam series. Center ICE, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a center. We're currently based out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and we have a statewide mission to basically provide 3 things: startup funding, support, and experiences to staff, students, faculty, and members of the community to engage in the startup ecosystem, an entrepreneur ecosystem. So and then last but not least, I definitely wanted to mention today's session is being co-hosted by JEDC, the Juneau Economic Development Council. Brian, if I could, maybe you could just briefly jump in and describe JEDC for us.
Great, thanks, Nigel, and thank all the panelists for being here today. I'm excited about this week. Alaska Startup Week is also Global Entrepreneurship Week, and it's really critical that we focus on entrepreneurship. There's a lot of pivoting and reinventing happening these days. So JEDC, we are focused on Juneau and Southeast Alaska, but we go the way the state goes, so we're very involved in statewide economic development efforts as well. Innovation Summit's on this slide here. Thanks for including that. This year, we're going to focus on localization in a global economy. You know, we've seen the pandemic has just focused us, seeing how incredibly important our small businesses are to us, and also seeing how delicate globalization is with all of its benefits. There are some vulnerabilities that's exposed. So we're going to focus on how local economy focus is important in this global world. So that's at the end of February. 24th and 25th are the date. We're going virtual this year, and we're going to bleed over a little bit on a few days. But thanks, Nigel, for the opportunity to introduce JEDC and say a few words.
Brian, could you remind us 24th and 25th of which month?
I think everyone knows, but thank you. February, the last week of February, every year, Innovation Summit, February 24th and 25th, 2021. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. That's great. All right. Well, for those who haven't been to an Innovation Summit before, it is definitely a huge gathering of the minds across the state of Alaska, and highly encourage folks to come to that event. And it's been with JEDC's help today that we've managed to pull together such a great panel for the very first of the ICE Jam series. So this very first event is centered around learning a bit about how to fund your startup. And I'm really pleased because we're joined today by Gary Klopfer, John Wanamaker, Will Fowler, and Cindy Middlestat, who all are directly involved in funding and supporting startup enterprises at different stages of their growth cycle, come with an amazing amount of wealth and knowledge in the background of how startups get funded, the fundraising process, and what it looks like. So what I'm really hoping for today is to have somewhat of an interactive conversation and discussion. And once again, would really encourage folks on the call to please put your questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom call. So on the Q&A box, please put any questions in you have, and I will be looking at them as a host, and Solomon's in the background going to catch me in case I miss one, to fire those over to our panelists that we have here today who are going to be engaging in this. So for the format of this event, and really briefly, my hope is that we're going to be able to go around and basically hear a little bit from each of these speakers that we have with us about some of their experiences, or at least advices they would give to entrepreneurs coming in and looking at fundraising. Because commonly what happens is that first in Alaska, there's maybe a misconception that Alaska doesn't have any sort of pools of money to help support and fund startups. And I think the second common misconception, the second challenge is that where do I go to find out what I need to find out, and how do I navigate this surround? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick on the non-Alaskan, Will Fowler, who's joining us from outside. And I think, maybe on a more general term, will you be able to speak for a few minutes on just, how should startups, and entrepreneurs who are just thinking about fundraising, what are some of the very first things they need to be thinking about and doing? And please feel free to briefly introduce yourself as well at the beginning of that.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Nigel. I'm Will Fowler. I run Signalrock Capital. Signalrock is a group that helps form angel funds and early stage angel investing vehicles around the country. I've worked the past 2 years with the Alaska Angel Conference. I'm working with them again this year, and so I'm also an investor. I have holdings in lots of companies. And so I've worked on the startup side. I've been in the startups. Thought I was going to be a startup CEO, and I realized how hard that was, and I decided to do something easier. And so that's my perspective. I'm based in Boise, Idaho. I learned everything about angel investing in Boise, and have since picked up a lot more knowledge working in other markets. But that's my home base, and that's my perspective. So let me just broach the subject on like, what are some things you should think about if you're trying to raise capital? The first is understand your business model and understand what exactly you're asking for. So this is something that I see a lot. Startups say, well, I need to get investment capital. And I said, well, what's your business? And it's a car wash. Okay, nothing wrong with getting investment capital around a car wash. They're very profitable businesses. But what kind of a business model do you have? And what kind of a value are you going to offer to the investors? So really understanding, is there an end game? Is this going to be lifelong cash flow? It can help structure how you have a conversation with investors when you choose to engage with them. The other thing is know that when you're talking to investors and when you're thinking about raising capital at an early stage, the investors are taking an extraordinary amount of risk by potentially investing in your business. So we know that we're going to 70% of our investments return less than what we put in, right? So the most likely outcome of any single investment for us is failure. So it's got to be a big upside because we're taking all that risk. So we don't do it because we just like throwing money away, or we just are gamblers and like taking big risks. We really do it because there is a payout at the end, and we need to know that payout is going to be worth the risk that we take at the beginning. So understand that they're going to take a ton of risk by coming in, and because of that, they're going to ask a bunch of questions. They're going to try to de-risk the investment as much as they can before they place money in it. And that doesn't mean that they want to tell you what to do for the rest of your business. If they do, maybe that's not the right investor for you. But that means that they're trying to understand, what are the risks. I'm okay with assuming some risk, but I need to know what they are and your plan to mitigate them in the long term. Maybe the third biggest thing to know is that you're wrong. You are wrong about so many things at an early stage, and that's okay. It's okay to say, I don't know, but I know I'm going to find out. I know this plan I have is the beginning of something, not the end. So it's okay to come to terms with the fact that you're wrong about a ton of stuff. And whoever you talk to as an investor, they're wrong about a ton of stuff too. The only thing that truly matters when you're starting out a business and you're seeking investment capital is that you're creating an extraordinary amount of value for your customers, that you have an outsized growth opportunity, and that you have tenacity. You will find your way to the business model that is the best one as you go, as long as you're focused on creating outsized growth opportunities and outsized value for your customers. So a lot of times I see startup CEOs get in arguments about who's right and who's wrong with potential investors. And it's okay. It's okay to just be wrong. And it's okay to partner with them, take all the knowledge you can, use all the knowledge you can from them, and leverage that to make decisions. You don't have to do what they say. You don't have to get in an argument about who's right or wrong, as long as you've got that growth mindset. So those are in terms of approaching the decision to bring on investors, that's my perspective. Lastly, I would just say, when it comes to actually engaging with investors and finding them and getting them involved, start at home. Start with people who know you, who believe in you. That's what your investors are going to invest in. They're investing in you and your team, not necessarily your idea. So start at home. Find those people who believe in you no matter what. Leverage that positivity, leverage that growth to find new investors. We get calls all the time in Boise. Our investing groups, other groups call us and they say, "Hey, did you invest in this company out of Boise?" And we'll say, maybe we say, yeah. And they say, oh, great. So what do you know about them? We'll tell them that. And if, when we have that kind of conversation, they have a much greater likelihood of getting investment wherever they're seeking it. When they call and they say, "Hey, did you invest in so-and-so company?" And I say, "No, we didn't." They say, well, why? And we tell them why we didn't. It's almost always a deal killer for them. So getting capital close to home first will help you get capital farther away from home later. So I'll get off my soapbox. That's my first perspective.
Thank you, Will. That was great. And I think that, just talking away with some of those key takeaways, I saw that Gary was in the background there, nodding with a certain amount of knowing wisdom, and he was definitely knowingly nodding along there. So I would love to pick at what that, what he was sort of really nodding at there. And it would be great to maybe hear some of Gary's perspective as an active angel investor. Sort of, what do you see being some of those, how would you best be approached by an entrepreneur? I guess, Gary, is sort of the right approach to this, and if you would be willing just to give a quick intro to yourself as well. Just prior to you doing that, just so I can have a quick shout out to everyone else. For folks who have questions for any of the speakers, instead of saving them all for the very end, feel free to use the Q&A box. Just say, question for Will, and then feel free to type your question in the Q&A box. We will get to questions, and we'll have lots of time for them towards the second half of this session. And I also love the fact that startups are in the chat shouting out about their businesses. Use the chat as free as you guys like. I think every bit of hustle is always well respected by especially the group that we have on this call here today. So Gary, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Will, I was nodding because I agree with just about everything you said. Anybody's been in this business for a while, especially when you started talking about the inherent risks. Anyway, my name is Gary Klopfer. I happen to be president of a local group, Alaska Investor Network. We've been around now for a little over 4 years. We're actually a kind of a spin-off or a subchild of the 49th State Fund, which got started up here about 12 years ago. No, well, yeah, 8 years ago, excuse me, in 2012. But anyway, so what our group is basically about 30 or 40 different investors, all accredited, that have the ability to invest in companies if in fact they find something worthwhile. We have invested in a number of the different funds in Alaska that there are. We don't run our own fund, we all do it individually, but we meet on a monthly basis during the winter. Used to be once upon a time with nice drinks and appetizers, but now it's this way. But anyway, as Will was saying, my background also is I've also owned businesses. I own commercial property, buildings that I have to run. I have an investment firm that I ran. I also had a brew pub that I ran, and I'm still actively involved in the beer business along those lines. Plus, I'm involved in, just like Will, I'm involved in probably, I don't know, well over 100 different companies across the United States. But my experience has been mainly with small startups, pre-revenue. So that's something that these are companies that basically the individuals have a great idea, or at least they think they do. And so they've done what Will had said. They went to all of their friends and family, got as much money as they could get. And now they really need some more money for the next step as they envision it. So they turn around and say, hey, they want to have some money coming from some investors. The nice thing about our group is if we were to go back 10 years ago, I've been in the investment business for over 30 years in Alaska. And if you would have asked me, 15 years ago about angel investing, I would have told you, is that people that buy those Gideon Bibles and put it in hotel rooms or something? I had no idea what angel investing was. It just didn't show up. I mean, since that time, and again, the last 8 to 10 years, I've been very active in it. And the biggest thing is to help people get to that funding level. So for me, the experience has been, number one, again, as Will said, you need to have very concise ideas on what you're trying to do. You have an idea for a business, but most of the time people just have ideas. They don't really know how to go about the execution of it. So normally what happens, and certainly with our group, is anybody that has a fledgling company that they think is a good match with us, what they do is they would get a hold of us. What we would do is get our core group of individuals to try and meet with them, to have them do their infamous pitch. And the biggest mistake I see there is people have to practice. They have to try to engage the investor. There has to be an, the infamous elevated discussion where you can turn around and say, hey, I'm interested. Number one, you told me what your product is. You told me how you're going to make your product. You told me what your market is. You told me the size of the market, and it has to be all reasonably accessible or achievable. Don't tell me, I love the phrase, oh, this market's billions. And everybody in today's world, oh, this thing is worth billions. Fine. Tell me how you get the first million and how you can successfully do it. Not only that, once you get the money, whatever you're asking for, 20, 50, 100 grand or more, what are you going to do with the money? What milestones are you going to reach that we can actually see that you're doing it along those lines? So a major thing also for us is we tend to do a lot more mentoring, okay? So it's not just giving you a check. Most of the time we're very involved with your company. So a lot of people know nothing about, they may know nothing about marketing. Well, out of the 30 or 40 different individuals we know, there's somebody in marketing. Or they don't know anything about accounting, or they don't know anything about books. So lots of times we'll have meetings with people or founders, and we'll say, hey, your idea is pretty good, but you really need to do some work on it. And here's the areas you should work on. And lots of times they'll come back and attempt to repitch, and they're successful a year later or whatever it happens to be. So, I mean, it's not just getting the money, it's also you're getting access now to all of these different individuals in whatever different fields they were in, whether they're engineers, whether they're computer people, whether they're accountants. And I think that's, lots of time that's worth more than the money you might be getting. So
Gary, there's a saying that I use and I see is true all the time, which is, if you want money, ask for some advice. If you want advice, ask for some money. So approaching investors as a way to learn from them and bring them on as mentors is a great way to go about it, I think.
Yeah, and only again to say what Will had said originally, I think most founders, well, number one, my first advice would be try not to start a company by yourself. I mean, because I can tell you as an angel investor, I'm very apprehensive to invest in somebody, number one, has never started the company. Number two, it's him or her. And, what about the Mack truck rule? They get sick and all of a sudden, boop, it's gone. So my advice would be at least try to have a minimum 2 founders, so you can play off each other. And also, one can step in for the other one, which is, very, very beneficial, I would say. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is, like Will had mentioned, and then I'll be quiet, is the risk factor. I mean, the risk factor is incredible. If you look at the numbers, most founders, in my opinion, when you first talk to them and then they say, okay, what would you want for this $25,000, $50,000? And you tell them and you see their jaw drop, they're like, this is my baby, and you want its arm and its leg? Well, the problem is, as Will mentioned, anybody that knows anything about numbers, it's a numbers game. And the tough part in this business, especially at pre-revenue, it's exceedingly risky. I mean, Will was kind when he said 7 out of 10, you get 1 back and, get back your money. I'm thinking, whoa, yeah. I mean, for the most part, what's happening certainly in the last 5 years is something, the losers are coming much faster. So you wind up losing all of those, 7 potential investments much quicker, and any winners are taking much longer. It used to be the infamous 3 to 7 year window. Now somehow it's the 7 to 12 year window. So, I mean, it's becoming a lot more tough. So we're not trying to, it's got to be a win-win. We're not investing with founders or asking for what we're asking for to take over your company. We have no interest in that. We just want to make sure that we're trying to guide you and it can be a win-win environment for both. So anyway, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Gary. So, I mean, I think that, there's a lot of sage advice, and it's interesting that, it's almost like, there's like a fountain of advice coming at us from these investors who've worked with so many companies, and you can almost, at least for me, I can hear it loud and clear in your voice, which is like, do this, don't do that, like, you know, and if you could just go and shake up all the entrepreneurs and get them to all hear this stuff, I almost feel that, well, I guess that's what we're doing, you know, here and today. And Cindy, you work with, you know, some very different types of entrepreneurs across the state, and I've seen you engaged in so many of our different entrepreneurial programs, and I know you're a huge advocate for, you know, first of all, you know, what I would say is not normally the traditional startup, but also some of the small businesses and, you know, engaging some parts of rural Alaska as well. So Cindy, I'd love if you could maybe briefly introduce yourself and then sort of like tie into either the conversation Will and Gary are having, or really, you know, just, you know, some of the Alaskan components of, you know, how entrepreneurs need to be thinking and navigating this landscape around fundraising and funding. So.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Middlestad. I'm the manager for the Bristol Bay Development Fund. The Bristol Bay Development Fund serves the Bristol Bay region, defined by the Alaska Native Corporation's boundaries, if you will, or economic regions in Alaska. And the fund is here to serve those who are located in the region or businesses that are located outside the region, but offers a social or economic benefit to Bristol Bay. I think much of what I'm hearing, and I'm going to add just a bit more onto that, but the fund is designed to be, I think, a more patient and nurturing approach to investing in businesses. Over the years, we've added more technical assistance for entrepreneurs, and we've introduced another program, which is a business plan competition that offers a boot camp component to that as well. So investing in the knowledge component and business readiness is, I think, a critical element for the fund to do that, as well as being an access point to capital.
So Cindy, I don't know if you had any example stories you could sort of like, you know, conjure up around some of the, you know, the startups and the entrepreneurs that you work with on a regular and active basis, but just, you know, when they come in, I think, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs, the first thing they think they need is money. And yet so much of what you just described you're providing is so much of this entrepreneurial, experience and support type activities. Why? I mean, if all they need is money, why don't we just give them a bunch of money? Why do they need to do the other stuff? So.
You know, when I think about this and in supporting businesses, thinking about the long term as well, the resiliency and sustainability of businesses in rural Alaska too. So I think taking that time and investing in the upfront knowledge growth is critical. So businesses have a more long-term horizon beyond just that startup component, but being thoughtful in planning for growth and planning for resiliency.
Thank you, Cindy. And then John, you've been sitting here very patiently for the whole time. It's always hard to be the fourth person on the panel to speak, but it'd be great to hear briefly from you. You know, sort of your background experience. I know that you work with startups that are not really startups anymore. They've always become sort of established companies on the growth trajectory. But you know, you see the full spectrum, the full gamut of it, and I think, you know, a lot of wisdom there. So I'd love to see, you know, with all of that in mind, and the advice that's been given from Will and Gary so far, and then, you know, Cindy's work that she does to have all these active programs that are out there through BBDF. What does an entrepreneur need to be thinking about when they're trying to navigate this realm of fundraising in Alaska and beyond? So, you know, what does that fit into? So, John, please an introduction, and then, yeah, any thoughts you have there?
Sure. I'm John Wanamaker, and I've been an active angel investor for 25 years. The past year, I partnered in and joined up with my friend Rob Gillum and stood up a private investment fund at McKinley Capital. We're just north of $100 million committed capital in that fund. And that fund is stage and industry agnostic because it has an Alaskan overlay or an Alaskan mandate to it, a theme. And so we do approach from the early stage venture all the way to growth equity and buyout. And we have investments right now that span that entire stage. So it's a bit of a unique animal in the private equity, private investment world. we do, our exposure in the early stage is, we do have some direct, but our check size is, normally north of $5 million. I mean, it's just anything smaller than that, and it's just too inefficient for us to operate. We do have some exposure with fund to funds in the early stage that we serve as, and we are an investor and a limited partner in. And so they've been doing some work with companies here in Alaska. That's Pipeline Capital, Joel Yarman. Your question about Nigel, about capital and availability in Alaska, I would say that there is plenty of capital available. I think all your panelists have hit on it right now. It's have a tight case, be a believer in it, and be reasonable. That's kind of the. And in terms of follow-on capital, we hope that all of these angels here are successful, because that fills our pipe for bigger checks down the road. So Gary, I want you to make a lot of money so I can follow on.
And everybody, just for full disclosure, I bought my very first cell phone from John's company. So that just shows you how long he's been involved in it.
Gary and I didn't have any gray in our beards when we first met each other.
I had hair.
Well, there's definitely some long embedded relationships, and I think relationships is the other piece that I wanted to touch on here, because I think so much of Alaska operates around the relational knowledge, and and folks coming into it, especially entrepreneurs who are new to the whole startup community that we have and the broader entrepreneur ecosystem that exists. Sometimes aren't sure exactly again how to navigate and figure out who's who, what's what, and any advice you guys have for sort of the importance of building relationships with the investors that you're hoping to bring on board, and when is the right time to that? Do you do that when you're looking for money that day and you look for exactly the right type of investor, or John, when is the right time to start talking to you with the hopes to engage in that? So maybe I'll throw it back to you first, John, and then maybe hear from other panelists too.
Yeah, it's a great question, Nigel, and it's not the perfunctory. It's a great question. It really is. I mean, it's you can't start too early on the relationships, and I'm going to counter that with you want to be careful how you structure that, because I'd love to to geek out and hear about all these cool things. I mean, I've just looked at Decarp and Wise and Remora and a number of others that have posted on the chat. That's fantastic. When I say I'm going to put a caveat to that, that is it's important to be considerate of people's times. I mean, it's a busy life. I think feeding some newsletters or email feeds is a great way to continue that relationship till you get to the point where, like, our fund is the right, you're at the right stage or size, check size. The other thing that the caveat is when it comes time to make that ask, make sure you have a definitive ask, so it's clear that this is no longer just informative relationship maintenance, but it's time, John, for you to pay attention. I've got a specific ask, and here's the value proposition. So that's the only qualifier I'd add.
So I want to open up to the rest of the panel and see if anyone else has sort of guidance on how do you start navigating those relationships with investors. Is there ever a time when it's too early to be speaking to them? So being mindful of John's point there, can that have a negative impact on startups as well if you speak to an investor too soon?
Yeah, let me just jump in for a second. I would say you'd want to be a little bit hesitant about speaking to an investor, but you certainly want to start building your contacts as soon as as soon as that genesis of an idea of a company forms in your head. I mean, you should be excited about it, obviously, and you should be telling everybody you have this new widget that you're designing, you and Sally are putting this thing together, and it's the latest thing since sliced bread and all that kind of stuff. And then proceed ahead to then anybody, if you're at the university, talk to some professors. If you're downtown, go to A Million Cups. Give any way you have an opportunity to speak, to tell somebody about your idea or your concept, do it, because magically those people will go out and talk to other people, and then pretty soon connections start showing up. And then those connections will gradually lead to certainly to our group. And then you'll be able to do your pitch in front of us potentially. And then hopefully from there, exactly like John said, you'll step up from there. I mean, it's just amazing. The more you're in this business for a long time, I was laughing. I was at a party in California and my phone rang and it was somebody from Alaska telling me about somebody in New York that wanted money. And, within a matter of a couple of days, I made another investment just through side connections that happen. And that's just the way this business works. And the other thing is then it's a referral business. When I feel comfortable about somebody that I know that he or she has a pretty good eye on what a company may be, and they're referring them to me, it's certainly a one-up. It's certainly advantageous to have that. So connections right away.
In addition to that, thanks, Gary. I mean, Cindy, I saw you unmute a couple of times, so.
I did, thank you. I actually like to hear from company founders or the early startups with their concepts far in advance of making the investment ask. The fund exists to actually support entrepreneurs or small business owners to do that. And it's advantageous if I know and develop that relationship early on. Oftentimes there are resources or connections that I can make during that startup phase. If there's technical assistance or other informative topics that a business may need, it's ideal to make those introductions or to identify those resources. So I appreciate developing the relationships early on. And then obviously, when it comes to making an investment ask, having a well thought out business plan is important too. So it's an opportunity for us to kind of take a bit maybe of a reverse approach to this and investing in those the early business knowledge and technical components so that the business owner is investment ready at the time they need it.
So I have a perspective on this, on relationships, because that's what it is. I mean, it's all about relationships. I would say there's no too early to start relationships. Never. You can start relationships as early as possible, but start them. You got to start them with the right context, right? If you just have an idea and you're starting a relationship and you're asking that person for money, that's too soon to ask. Doesn't mean that you can't engage with them and start a relationship with them, get advice, and leverage their network at some point when you're ready. Like, don't go to John when you're raising $100,000, friends and family round. That's too early to ask him for money. But that doesn't mean you can't start a relationship with him or start a relationship with somebody who knows him. So relationships are super important. I would say there are a couple other things that are like really critically important to know when you raise capital. One, it's scarce. So know where it is. Like, you've got to know what your ecosystem looks like, and you've got to go after the capital that is close to you first. Two, traction is incredibly important. You've got to be able to show traction. Traction does not always mean sales, but you've got to be able to show that you can move something from A to B, and you've got a way to measure that. And you're getting, like, your hypothesis is working, or you're working on making it work. Three, market size matters. You can have a great business in a really small market you will not be investable because of that. Unless your market is really small and massively profitable, you've got to have a market size in order to grow, 100x. You've got to be able to scale. So if it's a one-to-one, if like we get one customer, we add one employee, that's not scalable. You've got to figure out what is massively scalable to create those outsized returns. So scalability equals return for investors a lot of times. And then exit is essential. If you're looking for investors at this kind of a stage, angel investors, you have to know how you want to exit, or that you want an exit, and what realistically that looks like based on your traction, based on your market size, and all those things. And then lastly, don't go terms crazy. So a lot of early stage startup CEOs get really fixated on terms of that first round of capital. And it's because you've got sometimes really talented lawyer advising you, which they should be doing, but understand that terms have to be fair and equitable to the investors as well. And getting kind of overloaded with all these protections for the entrepreneur won't do you any good at the first stage anyway. Only two things are going to happen at an early stage. So let's say you raise $300,000 in capital. One of two things are going to happen. You're going to raise more capital because you're growing, or you're going to go bankrupt. There's no real in between. And so getting caught up in all these protective terms that are really geared for later stage entrepreneurs and CEOs can be really damaging because it creates arguments that aren't healthy. So that's some of my kind of, I don't know, like 5 or 6 things to think about when you start these relationships, and things to ask about and seek advice on.
Nigel, I'd like to just jump on a couple of things. Totally agree with all the comments. Obviously, the biggest thing I'd also say is that in the very beginning, make sure you have the comfort level. I'm talking about the founders. They have a comfort level with who they're speaking with, as a potential investment, because this is going to be, as we mentioned earlier, a very long-term relationship. So, and it goes both ways. I mean, I've had pitches from companies that the idea was potentially excellent, but I didn't particularly care for the individuals, or didn't feel comfortable or trust them that much. So that's not to walk away, you run away. I mean, because you're going to spend 10 years with these people who you're now getting in bed with. So you better have a very, very good comfort level and have no hidden agendas. Everything's wide open. It's, and view it as a win-win. Otherwise, don't do it. I mean, run away.
Thank you, Gary. So we have got a few questions that have been popping up in the Q&A, and I want to make sure that we start addressing those, because I imagine more will roll in as we go forward. So I see 3 questions right now. There has been a little bit of chat recently. Scott Bell put something in the chat, as well as there was a question regarding can someone speak a bit to the Angel Conference? And I know, Will, last year you were an active proponent of that, and Brian Holst with JEDC were one of the co-organizers of it in the region. And this year I know it's moved up closer to our realm, up at sort of Center ICE as one of the co-organizers as well, up in Fairbanks. But yeah, Will, if you'd be willing, could you briefly talk about the Angel Conference and how that ties into sort of early stage fundraising for entrepreneurs to think about? And for other folks who have got questions, please keep putting them in the Q&A section, and we're going to start addressing those now. So.
Yeah, so think about, startups can think about the Alaska Angel Conference kind of like a winner-take-all pitch event. It's deeper than that, but the winner gets $50,000 to $200,000 in investment capital. So it's a significant amount of money that's put in. It's the reason it exists is to bring investors together, teach them about angel investing, and create networks of investors across Alaska that startups can have access to. So what happens is a group of investors come together. We form a fund with a really small ask of investors, like $5,000. So as an investor, if you want to learn how to invest, you can put $5,000 into this fund and then learn how to invest. Once we get all that money pooled together, we know how much we have, somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000. And we say, okay, it's winner take all. And so then all the startups who want to compete for that apply. There's definitely a pitch. There's ongoing conversations. Then there's due diligence. So you will go through a due diligence process with those investors, should you make it that far. And there's usually 4 or 5 finalists. And then the day of the event is when those 4 or 5 finalists are showcased to everybody. And the investors also showcase their process. And at the end, they pick one of those companies that gets a big fat check. And that's it's a really awesome event to either be a part of as an investor, to apply for as a startup, or just to watch. If you're curious about the process, attend the event and just watch to see how this world operates.
So I would definitely want to take the time to direct folks to, in the chat, Scott Bell put in a link to the akangelconference.com. I also wanted to highlight that they have a special session later this week during Startup Week. So that is on the large Startup Week schedule. And please do, go check out those other events if you have deeper questions about any specific component. Today's session, we're really just trying to highlight there is, to make it crystal clear, there is a ton of different funding opportunities here in the state of Alaska. and beyond to help support early stage entrepreneurs who are trying to grow and succeed in making their startups happen and their businesses happen. And although I think that it can be somewhat overwhelming, I mean, there feels so much wisdom being shared through this conversation today. I know that from an entrepreneur perspective that entrepreneurs are pretty good at drinking from the fire hose, trying to differentiate all that information and trying to figure out where they go next. But I see another question that's kind of correlated to that from Meg Waite, who, and this is a bit more of I think maybe a philosophical question, but who knows, maybe it's an investment question. The time spent working on the startup versus working in the startup, and are funders willing to pay for that time? And I think where I think I understand Meg's question coming from is really when we think about the time spent to do the development of the business, thinking about how the structure of the business should be set up, thinking about what its actual business model validation should be, and like trying to actually spend time doing hiring and everything else. When an investor invests in a business, are the investors willing to pay for some of that on the startup work? Or are they just looking to pay for the person to just be in the startup and grind it out? And maybe it's maybe any thoughts you have on the question. So I'll see if anyone in the panelists want to raise their hand and take a stab at it. Oh, back to Will.
I mean, if nobody else is, I can get it started. There's no difference at the beginning. You've got to do both all the time. And that's the expectation, is that you've got to learn how to be a leader. You've got to learn how to build a team if you've never done it before, and you've got to give that company what it needs. So you've got to both be moving it forward and be working on the business and creating the right kind of structure so it can grow. And that's the grind. That's why it's so hard to be a startup CEO.
Yeah, and also along those lines, I mean, obviously you have to, because many businesses, they head off in one direction only to realize that really is not feasible or not economical, and then they shift. And again, if you have great founders that have good head on their shoulders, the investors certainly staying with them and saying, okay, well, how do we make this successful? So it's not that. Rarely do I see companies say, this is what we're doing, and that's all they do. I mean, the economy out there, look at COVID. Look at, I've invested in so many companies that I would have never been blindsided by something like COVID, and it turns out. I mean, it just happens. So, I mean, you have to be able to shuck and jive and be nimble, or, don't enter into this business.
That's great. So I'm going to keep pushing us through questions. I mean, Meg had a second part to her question as well, which I think is mostly got answered, but it was really a bit about the timeline spent on phases of development. I think that, what is an appropriate timeline when an entrepreneur is talking to an investor, are they, the investor's getting on board for a period of an investment. What does that timeline generally sort of, feel right and be talking about as far as how much funding should they be looking for in a period of time, and also further on, like, what timeline are you talking about over the length of the company, or how far do you have to project out? Go on, John.
Yeah, the amount of funding you should ask for is the absolute minimum that will get you to the next round. I mean, that's efficient capital raise. You don't want to raise too much money, because you're just taking unneeded dilution and your valuation hasn't stepped up. So to make that point again is you want to raise enough money to get you successfully to the next step up in valuation. So when you sell equity at that round, you give away less equity for a larger amount of money that you're raising. That said, nothing's worse than being underfunded and you don't meet that milestone. That's just death. So it's a precarious balance. But I always encourage entrepreneurs in the early stages, if you haven't maxed your credit cards, you haven't leveraged your house, if you haven't tapped mom and dad and your spouse's retirement fund, you shouldn't be asking for money. I mean, I say that kind of cheekily, there are appropriate times to ask. But the point of that is the most expensive thing you're ever going to buy in your life is equity capital. If you really believe you are on to the next big thing, a unicorn, then why on earth are you willing to give away what Gary wants for his seed stage investment? Right? I mean, unless you've fully exhausted and put everything you have into it, then you're asking for money too early. And I recognize that isn't to say that you should do all those things. I mean, there's life to be lived. You need to pay the mortgage and feed the cat and feed the kids, and not necessarily in that order. You know, just be cognizant of the fact that when you raise equity capital, it's not cheap. It's not free money. I mean, you're giving away a big chunk.
John, every company thinks they're a unicorn.
Well, we can talk about unicorn hunting in a second. So I see one last question sort of sitting here that's that I want to broaden out to another maybe broader question. So I think there's a question here sort of asking about how much equity does the Alaska Angel Conference commonly take in a startup? But I think, the better question there is an early stage startup for $100,000. What amount of equity should you be looking to potentially, be giving away? So how expensive is that money, John? Like, Cindy, do you have any thoughts, or Will, in this?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. So the national average is somewhere between 15 and 30% for a first round. So and that depends on how much money you're raising and how valuable you can convince other people your company is before you raise capital. But early stage entrepreneurs, just national averages on the low range is around 15 to 18%. On the high range is around 28 to 32% in terms of how much of the company they sell, how much of that equity they sell in that first priced round. A lot of first rounds these days take the form of a convertible note. And a convertible note is a loan that converts to equity with predetermined triggers and some stipulations around, how it converts to equity or what the discount is on that. But so a lot of times you kind of kick the can down the road a little bit with a convertible note that says, we're not going to discuss how much the company's valued. We'll tell you how much, we'll put a maximum amount on it, and we'll give you some criteria down the road. But for now, we're going to move fast. We're going to take this as a loan and get the company moving. But that gives you some examples of what we're seeing typically around the country.
And can I just jump in too on that? The other thing to be cautious of as founders is don't give tons of equity, pieces of equity to all your friends and family and all that. I mean, if you mess up your cap table, most early investors don't even want to look at it because it's going to take an attorney way too much time and money to figure out who owns what and where. So be very cautious about giving away too much of your company or any of it initially. Try to keep it, do it either through just, they love you, they want to give you the money, or they're going to loan it to you, or wherever it happens to be. But just be a little cautious. Don't wind up coming to me and say, and I look at it and you already given away 35% of the company already. And I'm saying, as Will just said, and I want 25 or 30. Now you're a minority as founders. It's not a good place to be. We always attempt to have the founders still in the majority position in the early rounds.
Yeah, I think that so much of our advice seems to come from Shark Tank sometimes that we sometimes forget, that the real world actually operates somewhat differently from that. So there is another question sitting in the chat, and it seems to be very much tied to the same conversation, which is, can you guys talk to valuations, and then how does one value their company? And I think there's that is such a heavily loaded question. We could sit here for another hour and easily go into this. But John, Cindy, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
There's only one realistic methodology for valuation. That's a purchase. That's the only real valuation. Everything else is academic. So it's what someone's willing to give you for your company, and there's rules of thumb, and there are multiples of EBITDA and multiples on future revenue, or and that can get you in the ballpark. But what you guys are talking about in the early stage, particularly, it's hard to value. So you look at some what is the current trend in the funding rounds. How much equity are people giving up for a successful round? That can get you into the ballpark. But the other thing I'd say when you're talking about valuation, particularly at an early stage or a seed round or an early round, if you really are onto something big like a unicorn, then the haggling at that early round is kind of in the noise. I mean, you're talking about whether it's a pre-money of 10 or a pre-money of 15. That's a percentage-wise a material difference. But if you're going to be $1 billion company, it's noise. So don't get wrapped around the axle in percentages.
Yeah, seems like exciting advice. Cindy, do you have any thoughts on company values in Alaska? Because I'm sure that they vary heavily, and I do see a lot of conversations. So people bring up stuff they put off the web, for Silicon Valley, for example, and they say like, well, wait a minute, those things don't match. So what do you see here in Alaska? Any thoughts on valuations?
Well, let me tell you what hasn't worked for the fund is the pie in the sky format of valuing business or business assets as well. So, I think investors, company owners should expect investors to drill down and take a look at business assets, the goodwill, other aspects of putting together that valuation. But being rational and reasonable, I think, is most important for our businesses or taking a localized approach.
Thank you, Cindy. All right. Well,
on valuation, I just want to say on valuation, early stage companies, my advice is to understand how much capital you need first. Understand how much capital you need. So if that 300,000, 500,000, 200,000, and then look at what the national average is, then look at your market and go do some research on what similar stage companies have raised and what they valued at. If you can find that information, a lot of times investors will tell you. And then you'll get a good idea on, can you raise that? Is that much capital available for you there? And if so, what was the selling price for the investors when they did that? And then how do you stack up to those companies based on your talent, your traction, your stage of development? That it's pretty soft, but I think that local research based on how much money you need to raise will greatly inform how you arrive at that valuation, and do it in conjunction with your investors.
Yeah, thank you, Will. And I know I get this question all the time because people go like, where do I find that information? How do I see comparables? And, we're offering, with tech startups, we're often pointing them towards, resources like crunchbase.com, tell them to go on there, have a look, and they can hopefully start, getting some sense of numbers. But yeah, just talking to the investors in the community, they'll start giving you a pretty good sense really, really quickly. And nice thing about Alaska is it's a very flat hierarchy where everyone's very accessible. So definitely make the time to reach out and just engage them directly. I know that Gary can be swayed over a glass of beer, so that's easy. All right, I could call you Barry from now on, though, Gary. Sorry. All right, so with a couple of minutes left, I wanted to just quickly touch on, see if there's any last questions. Feel free to throw them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I just wanted to wrap up this session with just a quick couple of shout outs for the rest of the week and things to look out for, and then we'll go back to the panelists to just see if there's any last minute, thoughts and pieces to share from our group here. So just give me 1 second, I'll load this up. Yeah, here we go. Right, so with ICE Jam very much underway and our first session coming to a close really shortly during Startup Week, I wanted to highlight that we have a bunch of other great stuff happening during Startup Week all across the week. So tomorrow's session kind of got a bit modified from today's session. I saw a question in there from you, Candy, regarding what was happening with small business loans and where is the conversation of that today. But what we did is we kind of like flipped our events a little bit, and today was mostly focused on dilutive funding, equity-based funding, revenue-based financing, sort of type of stuff that investors are generally sort of doing, versus tomorrow where we're going to look mostly at non-dilutive funding, so things such as grants, contracts, and then also loans. So that's what tomorrow's session is going to be on. And again, all of these things are on the Startup Week schedule or through the Center ICE mailing list as you're getting those things coming out. Then on Wednesday, we've got a great conversation with the whole entrepreneurs ecosystem sort of getting together for a networking opportunity, as well as there's a digital marketing session that Center ICE is hosting, and that'll be really fun. We'll get in behind the weeds and talk about some tools. And what you'll find is through the week, at least with our sessions, we're going to getting more and more granular into some real details. And we're starting off with fairly broad kind of swaths and views, and we're getting into some more very specific details. On Thursday, we're going to be talking about small business innovation research accounting, so best accounting practices and how, more importantly, how startups can think about accounting when it comes down to grants and contracts and other pieces that fall into line with their non-traditional, let's say, accounting pieces that need to be put in there. And then last but not least, we have sort of an IP workshop on Friday, which every year has been really popular and just kind of covers a lot of the basics of IP, but we'll have two patent attorneys speaking at that event, and really, hope that be an engaged Q&A session for that. So yeah, there is a question from Gaming On, will this webinar be posted as a recording? I will tell you that we're recording it, and we are not sure if we'll be publishing it just yet, but we're going to go through, maybe make some edits, and at the end of the startup week, if we have some energy, we'll start putting these together and blast them out. So thanks for being here. And then I love that there's a question that someone has an idea for, so we'll talk about that in a second. Throughout the rest of the week, these are some of the sessions. Again, look out for those in your email. If you're connected to it, make sure you sign up for the Center ICE mailing list, either through our website or just go find the events through the Alaska Startup Week schedule. I couldn't do this without the amazing team around Center ICE. This week, we've got 5 of us helping organize these 7 events that we're putting on as part of a much broader whole week of stuff going on. But I definitely want to give a quick thanks to Meg, Solomon, Peter, and David, who are all actively working behind the scenes to make all this stuff come together and happen. Yeah, I look forward to inviting you all to join us at our events across the rest of this week at alaska.startupweek.co. So obviously the biggest thanks for today goes to my fellow panelists who are able to sort of engage in this conversation and topic. And yeah, huge round of applause for those guys. It's really hard when we have these hidden audiences, but I know that folks appreciate it. Any parting words of wisdom? We have kind of a soft close on these events. We never want to like hard stop them at 1 o'clock. So always having a soft close. If there's any questions that are rolling in, we'll take a few more until we sort of have to wrap things up. So yeah, any parting words of wisdom? And I don't know if, oh, actually there is a question here. So how about an entrepreneur who has an idea, who doesn't want to take it on or doesn't actually want to run with the idea, but just wants to tell somebody their idea and tell them to go build the company for them? So I get this question actually quite regularly. I get emails on a regular basis like, I've got this really great idea. I don't want to handle the company. Is this something Center ICE can do? And yeah, but I'd love to get the investor perspective on that.
Here's my perspective on that. Ideas don't make money. Ideas do not make money. You can have a million great ideas that, as an investor, that will not make any money. Business models make money. The work of creating a business machine is what makes money. So as an investor, ideas are meaningless to me. Show me a business, show me some traction, and then I'm interested.
Nigel, to promote David's book right here, Angel Investing, but really this, I sent it to you. If you could include this in as a slide for everyone. This is exactly what it talks about ideas. Ideas realistically are worthless without any execution. So it's a great little chart, and it gives everybody an idea of what they need to be thinking about when they're talking about ideas.
For those pursuing ideas or have ideas in Bristol Bay, or those businesses that have a concept maybe perhaps that benefits the region, we are actually looking for ideas or concepts, and through our Path to Prosperity business plan competition. And the purpose of that is we offer a business education boot camp to create that business model, to determine if there's feasibility in the business. So we've got the tools for those that want to take their business concept to the next step, but have to be willing and committed to the idea and building that business model.
Yeah, and I think that's really worth like ending the session on, is that there are a ton of great resources and programs that exist around the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Alaska to help support folks at all sorts of different stages, everything from startup weekends across to the Path to Prosperity program, as Cindy mentioned, and beyond that into our conferences like the Innovation Summit, and so many more things that go on year round. Supporting folks at like every stage of this journey, recognizing that there is multiple stages through the journey, and also knowing that often people are like trying to figure out, well, where do I take this thing? What do I do with it? Usually you've got to push it down at least one more rung, one more step. Go out there, pitch it to somebody else jumps on the team, they take it forward. There is definitely a relay race component to building companies and building startups that you do have to pass this baton along at some point, because no one's an expert in the entire thing. There's very few Mark Zuckerbergs in the world that take things from their college dorm room all the way to multi-billion-dollar companies. This is most commonly, it's something we pass down the line. And yeah, I've been really pleased to have everyone here. Brian, did you have any closing words as well for our panelists?
Nope. Startup weekends are just maybe the only thing you haven't mentioned yet, where a idea can be explored and shared with others. But great panel. I really enjoyed it. Well done.
Well, great. Well then, guys, I encourage everyone to please go on and look at the other events that are happening. Make sure you come back to Center ICE's ICE Jam event tomorrow, where we'll be talking about all that free money that's out there, the grants, the contracts, and the loans to help you get your business going. And it'll be interesting to sort of see the perspectives from the speakers there on when they should be going for those, as opposed to going for dilutive investments like we've talked about today. And yeah, look forward to seeing more of you throughout the week as we go forward. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. And I know that if you want to reach out to any of these folks, please either come through myself, nigel.sharp@alaska.edu. I'm always happy to make introductions. And then beyond that, get through them on Sched, and they'll be around during Startup Week all week long. So I'll let you guys get back to the fun, and we'll see everyone later. Thank you so much, everyone.